couple of people at the immigration department, so...
You've got some friends there?
Yes, we do. And they let us by.
Before he could legally sign his own contracts, Frankie Lymon was already one of the most recognizable voices in America. He was a teenager from one of the poorest corners of New York City, and within a matter of months he went from singing in a hallway to hearing his own voice on the radio in living rooms across the country. For a brief, dazzling stretch of the 1950s, he was everywhere, on television screens, on movie posters, on the covers of magazines that teenage girls kept hidden under their pillows. He seemed, from the outside, like the luckiest kid in America. But fame built that fast, on a foundation that shaky rarely holds. The same industry that turned Frankie into a star also quietly picked him apart, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left. By the time he died, he was 25 years old, broke, addicted, and largely forgotten by the very public that had once screamed his name. His funeral was a small, quiet affair. The record executives who had profited from his talent didn't send flowers. Former bandmates who had once stood beside him on stage didn't come. The story of how a beloved teenage idol ended up completely alone is one of the most quietly devastating stories in the history of American music, and it says as much about the business that surrounded him as it does about the boy himself. Frankie Lymon was born in the fall of 1942 and raised in the Washington Heights section of New York City, in a family that never had much room to breathe financially. His father drove a truck for a living and sang gospel music on the side with a local group, so the sound of harmony was a constant presence in the household even when money wasn't. His mother worked as a domestic worker, cleaning houses that weren't her own to help keep the family afloat. It was the kind of household where every paycheck was already spoken for before it arrived. Frankie didn't get much of a childhood in the traditional sense. He was working by the time he was 10 years old, delivering groceries for tip money that never quite stretched far enough. As he got a little older, by most accounts, he found other, less official ways to bring in cash around the neighborhood, the kind of hustles that were common for kids growing up in Harlem in that era, when the streets themselves functioned as a second classroom. He wasn't a bad kid. He was a resourceful one, doing what he had to do in a neighborhood that didn't leave much room for softness. Music found him almost by accident. At 12 years old, he wandered into a talent show at his junior high school, not to perform, but simply to watch. That night, a local group of teenage boys who sang doo-wop harmonies on street corners and in stairwells took the stage. Something about their sound pulled him in. After the show, he introduced himself to the group's lead singer and asked if he could join as a tenor. They gave him a chance, and it turned out he could really sing. Not long after, the group was rehearsing the way most groups like them did, in a public hallway of a Harlem apartment building, because none of their homes had a room big enough to hold 5 teenage boys and their harmonies. A passerby stopped to listen. He happened to be a working singer himself, already established in the R&B scene, and what he heard in that hallway stopped him in his tracks. He thought these kids sounded better, raw and untrained as they were, than plenty of acts he'd heard in professional studios. He offered to mentor them and eventually got them an audition with a small independent record label. The story of how their signature song came together is one of those strange, almost accidental moments that occasionally produces something timeless. A neighbor in the building had recently gone through a breakup, and his ex-girlfriend had left behind a stack of old love letters. He handed them over to the boys, half joking that maybe they could turn some of the words into a song. 2 of the group's members sifted through the letters and landed on a single romantic, slightly melancholy line about birds singing in the spring as if they were in love. That fragment became the seed of a melody they spent weeks shaping into something bigger. When the group finally got their shot at a real audition, the plan was for their usual lead singer to carry the vocal. But on the day it mattered most, he wasn't able to perform. Accounts differ on exactly why, whether illness or simply bad timing. But the outcome was the same. Frankie, who had been closely involved in shaping the song's melody, stepped up to the microphone instead. What came out of his mouth stunned the room. He had this bright, clear, boyish soprano that still carried a bit of grit and soul underneath it, a sound that was perfectly suited for the new, raw energy of rock and roll. The label signed the group on the spot, on the condition that Frankie stay on as the permanent lead voice. Not long after, at the suggestion of the session's producer, the group changed its name to something that better captured who they were and who they were singing to. A group of teenagers, making music for teenagers, at the exact moment that teenage culture was becoming its own commercial force in America. When their single hit the radio in early 1956, it didn't just do well. It exploded. It topped the R&B charts, cracked the pop top 10, and crossed the Atlantic to hit #1 in the UK. It sold millions of copies. At 13 years old, Frankie Lymon had become one of the first black teenage idols in American pop history, the voice of a brand new sound sweeping the country. And almost immediately, behind the scenes, the people who controlled his money started taking it. The business side of the record industry in the 1950s was, for young black artists especially, often closer to organized theft than legitimate commerce. When the label filed the official copyright paperwork for the group's breakout hit, the label owner made a decision that would echo for decades. He left the actual songwriters, two of Frankie's own bandmates, the teenagers who had genuinely written the words and shaped the melody, completely off the credits. Instead, the paperwork listed only the label owner himself and Frankie as the songwriters, entitling them to half of all future royalties for a song they hadn't written alone. Frankie had contributed to refining the melody, certainly, but the primary authorship belonged to his bandmates. None of that mattered on paper. The label had lawyers. The teenagers from Harlem did not. Things got worse a year later. The original label owner, buried in gambling debts, sold off his stake in the company to a man with deep, well-documented connections to organized crime. This new owner ran his part of the music business less like an executive and more like a mob operation, which, in essence, it was. One of his first moves was to strip the previous owner's name off the songwriting credits and replace it with his own, positioning himself to intercept the royalty checks from a song that was still selling by the millions every year. He hadn't written a single note of it. It didn't matter. He had the leverage, and he took it. To make sure the actual songwriters wouldn't cause trouble, management leaned hard on the fact that these were uneducated teenagers with no legal representation and no understanding of contract law. In 1956, the two bandmates who had written the song were pressured into signing away all future rights to it in exchange for a single flat payment of $1,000 for a song that had already sold millions of copies and would go on to earn millions more over the following decades. They signed. They had no idea what they were giving up. The men who orchestrated it walked away enormously wealthy. Frankie's own situation was arguably even worse, because the law was actually supposed to protect him. Because he was a minor, New York State required that his earnings be placed into a court-supervised trust fund until he came of age. The money was legally his, just held in trust. His managers ignored that requirement entirely. They told Frankie's parents, who had no reason to distrust the well-dressed businessman managing their son's career, that his earnings were being safely set aside in a corporate account. No such trust fund was ever properly established. The money Frankie earned from records, tours, and songwriting credits simply vanished into the business operations of the men running his career. He would never see the vast majority of what he earned. Once his managers realized just how much money Frankie alone could generate, they began quietly engineering a split between him and the rest of the group. During a European tour in 1957, Frankie was pushed to perform solo numbers over pre-recorded backing tracks while his bandmates were made to wait in the wings, watching him get all the spotlight. It bred exactly the kind of resentment his managers were counting on. By the fall of that year, at just 15 years old, Frankie had formally split from the group he'd started with, the only real creative family he'd ever had. Going solo destroyed him professionally almost overnight. What people hadn't fully appreciated was how much the group's collective harmonies had done to elevate his voice. Alone, his recordings felt thin, missing the depth and texture that had made the original hits so powerful. His solo singles flopped one after another. Radio stations that had played his earlier work on a loop wouldn't touch his new material. The audience that had adored him simply moved on to the next new sound. By 18, a boy who had once been one of the biggest names in American music was already considered a has-been in the industry's eyes. Stripped of his earnings and abandoned by the business that had built him up, Frankie was, by his late teens, broken essentially on his own. The men who had taken his money were living comfortably. Frankie was crashing in his grandmother's apartment, trying to figure out where his next meal was coming from. He would spend the rest of his life never recovering what had been taken from him. The chaos of Frankie's professional life bled directly into his personal relationships, which were, by any account, a tangled mess almost from the beginning. At 14, during the height of his fame, he began a secret relationship with a well-known female vocalist from another popular group, a woman several years his senior. Because of the age gap and the risk it posed to both of their carefully managed public images, the relationship was kept hidden, known only to a small circle of people close to both acts. Years later, in his early 20s, he met a young dancer while touring, a woman with her own difficult history involving substance struggles and minor legal trouble. They married quickly, and Frankie, who had never had much stability in his own life, seemed to genuinely crave the sense of home that marriage promised him. Shortly after, his wife became pregnant, and Frankie was reportedly overjoyed at the idea of becoming a father, of finally having someone who belonged to him unconditionally. Tragically, the baby was born with serious health complications and died just 2 days after birth. It was one more devastating loss stacked on top of everything else he'd already lost: his money, his career, his sense of family. What Frankie didn't know at the time was that his wife's divorce from a previous marriage had never been fully finalized in court. That technicality meant that, legally, their marriage was never valid to begin with, though Frankie spent the rest of his life believing otherwise. A couple of years later, he reconnected briefly with a singer he'd been involved with as a young teenager. She would later claim, in court testimony after his death, that the two of them traveled to Mexico and were married in a private ceremony there. No documentation of any such marriage, no certificate, no license, no official record, was ever found in archives on either side of the border. Her account was compelling to some, but ultimately unsupported by any hard evidence. In the final years of his life, while stationed at an army base, Frankie met a school teacher, a woman with no ties to the entertainment industry at all, just a steady job and a settled life. Something about her ordinary stability seemed to genuinely calm him. They married legally in a proper church ceremony in the summer of 1967. For roughly the last year of his life, by most accounts, Frankie finally had something resembling a real home with a wife who wanted nothing from his fame or his money, just his presence. More than a decade after his death, when a re-recording of his signature hit became a massive commercial success all over again, the resulting flood of royalty money set off a bitter legal battle. 3 different women, the dancer, the singer, and the school teacher, each filed claims in court asserting that they were Frankie's sole legal widow and rightful heir. The case dragged on for years, moving through multiple rulings and appeals, as the court tried to sort through marriages that were bigamous, undocumented, or genuinely legitimate. In the end, only the school teacher had a valid, verifiable marriage certificate, and she was ultimately recognized as the sole legal heir to his estate. It was a fittingly messy conclusion to a life that had never once been simple. Frankie's downfall wasn't just about stolen money or tangled relationships. The deepest tragedy of his story was the addiction that took hold of him as a teenager and never fully let go. Around age 15, puberty did what it does to every teenage boy. His voice deepened, losing the bright, boyish soprano tone that had made him famous in the first place. It was completely out of his control, a biological inevitability. But the audiences who had loved him as a novelty didn't want to hear a grown man's voice singing songs a child had made popular. Bookings dried up. Promoters who had once fought over him stopped calling. Already reeling from the loss of his fortune, his bandmates, and his career momentum, Frankie, still just a teenager himself, started looking for a way to cope. Older musicians in the Harlem jazz scene introduced him to hard drugs, and he developed a severe addiction with startling speed. A pivotal, painful moment came during a live television performance in the summer of 1957. Mid-song, Frankie danced briefly with a white teenage girl pulled from the studio audience. In the deeply segregated climate of the era, the sight of a young black performer dancing with a white girl on national television set off an immediate firestorm among Southern affiliate stations. The backlash was so severe that the network canceled the entire program. Frankie hadn't intended to make any kind of statement. He was just a kid enjoying a moment on stage, but the racial politics of the time turned an innocent gesture into a career-damaging scandal entirely outside of his control. As his addiction deepened through the following years, Frankie became increasingly unreliable, missing recording sessions, no-showing scheduled performances, disappearing for days at a time. A couple of major labels signed him hoping to recapture the magic of his earlier success, but each attempt collapsed the same way. Frankie simply wasn't well enough to show up and deliver. The contracts fell apart one after another, and with them, any real chance at a comeback. To fund the addiction, he turned increasingly toward petty crime, racking up arrests across multiple states through the early and mid-1960s for theft and drug possession. In 1966, facing a serious charge in New York, a judge gave him an ultimatum: prison or military service. Frankie chose the army, hoping, or perhaps his family hoping on his behalf, that the discipline and structure might help him get clean. It didn't work out that way. Desperate for money to sustain his addiction, he was repeatedly absent without leave, sneaking off base to perform low-paying gigs at small clubs just to scrape together cash. The army eventually ran out of patience and discharged him dishonorably. He was 24 years old, and there was almost nothing left of the life he'd once had. In early 1968, Frankie's manager managed to arrange one more shot at redemption, a deal with a record label in New York for a single studio session, a possible comeback recording. It was framed as his last real chance to turn things around, to prove there was still an audience for his voice, to maybe finally escape the cycle of addiction and poverty that had defined the last decade of his life. He traveled back to New York and stayed at his grandmother's Harlem apartment, in the same neighborhood where his story had begun more than a decade earlier. The pressure of the upcoming session, combined with his fear that his changed adult voice might fail him in the studio, seems to have pushed him further into his addiction rather than away from it.